Morning mist clung to the airfield like a shroud, masking the tension that hung heavy in the September air of 1943. Captain Elena Kozlova adjusted her mechanic's coveralls and checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Her hands, usually steady as she worked on aircraft engines, trembled slightly as she approached the sleek German transport plane that sat waiting on the tarmac of the occupied airfield near Minsk. Elena had been working as an aircraft mechanic for the German Luftwaffe for 8 months now, a position she had secured through forged documents and sheer determination. To her German supervisors, she was simply another local woman grateful for steady work under the new regime. They had no idea that Elena Kozlova was actually a highly trained Soviet intelligence operative who had infiltrated their ranks with a mission that could change the course of the war. The aircraft before her was no ordinary transport plane. It was specially modified for high-ranking officials, with reinforced communications equipment and luxury accommodations. Today, it would carry General Friedrich Kellner, one of the most ruthless and strategically brilliant commanders in the German army. Elena had spent weeks learning about Kellner's upcoming mission, and what she had discovered made her blood run cold. General Kellner was not just any officer. He was the architect of Operation Thunderbolt, a massive offensive planned for the Eastern Front that would involve coordinated attacks on 3 major Soviet cities simultaneously. The operation was designed to break the back of Soviet resistance and open a clear path to Moscow. Intelligence reports suggested that if Thunderbolt succeeded, it could end the war in Germany's favor within months. Elena had learned these details through careful eavesdropping and by gradually gaining the trust of German personnel who worked around the airfield. Her cover as a simple mechanic had proven perfect for gathering intelligence, as people tended to speak freely around workers they considered beneath their notice. She had overheard conversations between Kellner and his staff, had seen classified documents left carelessly on desks, and had pieced together the horrifying scope of the planned operation. The general himself was scheduled to fly to Berlin that morning for final planning meetings with the highest levels of German command. The operation was set to launch in just 10 days, and Kellner's expertise was crucial for its success. He had personally surveyed the target areas, had developed the tactical approaches, and was the only officer with complete knowledge of all 3 simultaneous attack vectors. Elena understood that stopping this flight could save thousands of lives. Without Kellner's direct input and coordination, Operation Thunderbolt would likely be delayed or significantly modified. The German command structure was rigid, and while other officers might attempt to execute the plan, none had Kellner's intimate knowledge of the terrain, Soviet defensive positions, and timing requirements that made the operation feasible. As she approached the aircraft, Elena's mind raced through the plan she had developed over sleepless nights. It had to appear accidental, and it had to be something that would ground the plane without immediately pointing to sabotage. A mechanical failure that could plausibly occur naturally, but would be serious enough to prevent takeoff. The solution lay in the hydraulic system that controlled the aircraft's landing gear. Elena had studied the technical manuals thoroughly and knew that a small puncture in a specific hydraulic line would cause a gradual pressure loss that wouldn't be immediately apparent during pre-flight checks, but would become critical during takeoff procedures. The landing gear would fail to retract properly, forcing an emergency landing and potentially causing significant damage to the aircraft. Elena had spent days preparing for this moment, carefully observing the timing of security patrols and learning the routines of other ground crew members. She knew she would have approximately 12 minutes while the guards changed shifts and before the pre-flight inspection team arrived. It was a narrow window, but it would have to be enough. She opened her toolkit with practiced efficiency, selecting a thin metal probe that she had modified for this specific purpose. The hydraulic access panel was located on the underside of the aircraft, partially hidden by the landing gear assembly. Elena slid beneath the plane, her heart pounding as she located the specific line she needed to puncture. The work required absolute precision. The puncture had to be small enough to escape immediate detection, but large enough to cause progressive system failure. Elena had practiced this procedure dozens of times on similar aircraft that had been damaged beyond repair, timing herself until she could complete the sabotage in under 3 minutes. As she worked, Elena couldn't help but think about the broader implications of her actions. She was one woman, armed with nothing but knowledge and determination, potentially altering the course of a world war. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was her commitment to protecting her homeland and the innocent people who would suffer if Operation Thunderbolt proceeded as planned. The sound of approaching footsteps made Elena's blood freeze. She quickly completed the puncture, ensuring it was positioned where it would be obscured by other mechanical components, and slid out from under the aircraft just as Sergeant Muller, the German flight supervisor, rounded the corner of the hangar. "Kozlova," Muller called out in his heavily accented Russian. "What are you doing with the general's aircraft?" Elena forced herself to remain calm, wiping her hands on a rag as she stood up. "Routine inspection, Sergeant. I noticed a small oil leak yesterday and wanted to ensure everything was properly tightened before the flight." Muller's eyes narrowed slightly, but Elena's explanation was plausible. She had built a reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail, qualities that the Germans appreciated in their workers. "Find anything?" "Just a loose fitting on the port engine cowling," Elena replied, holding up a wrench. "Already tightened. The aircraft is ready for service." Muller nodded curtly and moved on to inspect other aspects of the pre-flight preparations. Elena gathered her tools and walked calmly toward the hangar, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. She had done it. The sabotage was complete, and now she could only wait and hope that her calculations were correct. Over the next hour, Elena watched from a distance as the pre-flight procedures continued. General Kellner arrived precisely on schedule, a tall, imposing figure in his perfectly pressed uniform. He spoke briefly with the pilot and flight crew before boarding the aircraft. Elena noticed his confident bearing, the way other officers deferred to him, and realized she was looking at one of the most dangerous men in the German war machine. The engines started with their characteristic roar, and Elena held her breath as the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway. Everything appeared normal from the outside. The hydraulic failure she had engineered would only become apparent once the plane was airborne and the landing gear retraction sequence began. As the transport plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the gray morning sky, Elena felt a mixture of relief and terror. Her part of the operation was complete, but she wouldn't know if it had succeeded until the aircraft encountered problems. She forced herself to return to her normal duties, working on other planes and maintaining her cover while listening carefully for any news about the general's flight. 23 minutes after takeoff, alarm bells began ringing across the airfield. Radio chatter filled the control tower as urgent messages were exchanged with the aircraft. Elena strained to hear the details while pretending to focus on her work, but the rapid German was difficult to follow completely. What she could understand made her heart race with a combination of satisfaction and fear. The aircraft was reporting hydraulic system failure and requesting immediate emergency landing clearance. The landing gear had failed to retract properly, causing significant drag and making normal flight impossible. Elena watched as emergency vehicles raced across the tarmac, fire trucks and ambulances positioning themselves for the aircraft's return. The transport plane appeared on the horizon, flying lower and slower than normal, trailing a thin stream of hydraulic fluid that caught the sunlight like silver thread. The emergency landing was rough but successful. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced twice, and skidded to a stop with its landing gear partially collapsed. Emergency crews surrounded the plane immediately, and Elena could see figures evacuating through the main door. General Kellner emerged from the aircraft, visibly shaken but uninjured. Elena observed him from across the field as he gestured angrily at the aircraft and engaged in heated conversation with the maintenance supervisor. Even from a distance, his frustration was palpable. What Elena didn't know at the time was that her sabotage had accomplished even more than she had hoped. The emergency landing had not only grounded General Kellner, but had also damaged the aircraft beyond immediate repair. More importantly, the incident had triggered a comprehensive security investigation that would delay any rescheduled flights for days. In the aftermath of the emergency landing, Elena continued her work with apparent normalcy while secretly monitoring the developing situation. She learned that Kellner was furious about the delay and was demanding immediate alternative transportation to Berlin. However, no suitable aircraft was available at the airfield, and the nearest alternative was at an airfield 300 kilometers away. The delay was exactly what Elena had hoped for, but she knew her mission was far from over. The sabotage had bought time, but Kellner would eventually reach Berlin, and Operation Thunderbolt would proceed unless additional measures were taken. She needed to get word to Soviet intelligence about what she had learned, and she needed to do it without compromising her position. As evening approached and the damaged aircraft was towed to a maintenance hangar, Elena realized she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She was no longer just an intelligence operative gathering information. She had become an active saboteur whose actions had directly impacted German military operations. The risks to her cover had increased exponentially, but so had the potential impact of her mission. That night, as Elena lay in her small quarters near the airfield, she reviewed everything she knew about Operation Thunderbolt and began planning her next moves. The general's flight had been stopped, but the war was far from over. She had proven that one person in the right place at the right time could indeed change the course of history. Now she needed to ensure that her sacrifice would not be in vain. The woman who had started the day as a hidden observer had become a key player in a deadly game that would determine the fate of nations. Elena Kozlova had taken her first step toward becoming a legend, though she would never live to know the full extent of her impact on the war that raged around her. The investigation began at dawn the next morning. Elena watched from her workstation as German security officers swarmed the airfield like angry wasps, examining every inch of the damaged aircraft and questioning ground crew members one by one. She maintained her composure, continuing her assigned maintenance work while monitoring the developing situation from the corner of her eye. Colonel Hans Richter, the airfield security chief, was a meticulous man with a reputation for uncovering the smallest irregularities. Elena had observed him during her months at the base and knew he was both intelligent and ruthless. His investigation would be thorough, and she would need to be extremely careful to avoid arousing suspicion. The hydraulic system failure was being examined by a team of technical experts brought in from Berlin. Elena knew they would eventually discover the puncture she had made, but she had been careful to make it appear as though it could have resulted from metal fatigue or manufacturing defect. The key was ensuring that when they found it, the damage would not immediately scream sabotage. Meanwhile, General Kellner's fury at the delay was becoming legendary throughout the base. Elena overheard conversations between officers describing his explosive meetings with the base commander and his increasingly desperate attempts to arrange alternative transportation to Berlin. Every hour of delay was pushing Operation Thunderbolt closer to a potentially problematic timeline. Elena knew she needed to get intelligence about the operation to Soviet forces, but the communication protocols for her mission were extremely limited. She had been instructed to maintain radio silence, except in the most critical circumstances, and she possessed only a small, carefully concealed radio transmitter that could reach Soviet receivers under ideal atmospheric conditions. The opportunity came on her second evening after the sabotage. Elena had volunteered for night maintenance duty, a shift that was generally understaffed and less closely supervised. As she worked alone in the hangar, she was able to access areas of the base that were normally off-limits to ground crew. Her target was General Kellner's temporary office, where he had established a command post while waiting for replacement transportation. Elena had observed his patterns and knew he typically left the office around 10 o'clock for dinner and drinks with other senior officers. This gave her approximately 2 hours to search for additional intelligence about Operation Thunderbolt. The office was located in a converted barracks building with minimal security since it was considered a temporary facility. Elena approached through a maintenance corridor that ran beneath the building, accessing it through a service entrance that was rarely monitored. Her heart pounded as she picked the simple lock on the office door, skills she had learned during her intelligence training. Inside the office, Elena found a treasure trove of information. Kellner's frustration at the delay had made him careless, and classified documents were scattered across his desk and filing cabinets. Elena worked quickly, photographing pages with a tiny camera concealed in her toolkit, memorizing key details, and mapping out the complete structure of Operation Thunderbolt. What she discovered exceeded her worst fears. The operation was even more comprehensive than she had initially understood. Beyond the 3 major simultaneous attacks, there were planned secondary operations designed to cut supply lines, destroy communication networks, and eliminate key Soviet command personnel. The scope of the offensive was intended to completely collapse Soviet resistance in the western regions. Elena also discovered something that chilled her to the bone: detailed lists of civilian targets that were to be eliminated as part of the operation. Schools, hospitals, and residential areas were marked for destruction, not because of military necessity, but as part of a systematic campaign to break the will of the Soviet people. Operation Thunderbolt was not just a military offensive, it was a plan for genocide. The intelligence also revealed the identities of other German officers involved in planning the operation, communication codes, supply depot locations, and timing sequences that could be invaluable to Soviet defensive preparations. Elena realized she was looking at information that could not only save thousands of lives, but potentially turn the tide of the entire Eastern Front campaign. As she photographed the final documents, Elena heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She quickly returned everything to its original position and concealed herself behind a large filing cabinet just as the office door opened. General Kellner entered, accompanied by Colonel Richter and another officer Elena didn't recognize. "The investigation is proceeding, General," Richter was saying in German. "We've found evidence of deliberate sabotage, though it was expertly disguised." Elena's blood turned to ice. They had discovered her work faster than she had anticipated. "I want everyone involved in that aircraft's maintenance brought in for intensive questioning," Kellner responded, his voice cold with rage. "Someone on this base deliberately attempted to prevent my mission, and I want them found and executed." "We're already compiling a list of suspects, sir. Everyone who had access to the aircraft in the 48 hours before the flight is being investigated. We'll find the responsible party." Elena realized she had perhaps hours before she would be arrested and interrogated. She needed to transmit the intelligence she had gathered, and then find a way to escape the base before the security net closed around her completely. The officers continued their discussion for another 10 minutes before leaving the office. Elena waited an additional 15 minutes to ensure they wouldn't return, then carefully made her way back through the maintenance corridors to her radio hiding place. The radio was concealed in a ventilation shaft in the main hangar, positioned where the metal structure would help amplify her signal while providing electromagnetic shielding from German detection equipment. Elena had practiced the transmission procedure dozens of times, but never under such urgent circumstances. She powered up the radio and began transmitting the coded intelligence burst that would carry the most critical information about Operation Thunderbolt to Soviet receivers. The transmission took nearly 20 minutes, as she had to repeat key segments multiple times to ensure accurate reception despite atmospheric interference. As she concluded the transmission, Elena heard vehicles approaching the hangar. Through a window, she could see German security forces surrounding the building. Her time had run out. Elena quickly dismantled and concealed the radio, then tried to return to her normal workstation to maintain the pretense that she had been performing routine maintenance duties. But as she emerged from the back of the hangar, she found herself face to face with Colonel Richter and 4 armed guards. "Elena Kozlova," Richter said in Russian, his voice deceptively calm. "You will come with us for questioning." Elena's mind raced through potential responses, but she knew that attempting to flee or resist would only confirm their suspicions. Instead, she adopted an expression of confused concern. "Is something wrong, Colonel? I was just finishing the maintenance schedule for tomorrow." "We're investigating the sabotage of General Kellner's aircraft," Richter replied, watching her face carefully for any reaction. "We need to question everyone who had access to the plane. This is routine procedure." Elena allowed herself to be escorted to the base's interrogation facility, a converted storage building that had been equipped with cells and questioning rooms. She knew her cover story would need to be perfect, because Richter was clearly suspicious of her specifically. The interrogation began immediately. Elena was placed in a small, windowless room and questioned for hours about her background, her work on the aircraft, and her activities in the days leading up to the sabotage. She maintained her cover identity consistently, portraying herself as a loyal worker who was grateful for employment under the German administration. Richter's questions were methodical and repetitive, designed to catch inconsistencies in her story. He asked about technical details of her work, about other personnel she had interacted with, and about her personal history. Elena answered truthfully whenever possible, only lying when necessary to maintain her cover. The most dangerous moment came when Richter produced photographs of the sabotaged hydraulic line. "This damage was expertly created," he said, studying Elena's face. "It required detailed knowledge of aircraft systems and precise execution. Very few people on this base possess such skills." Elena forced herself to examine the photographs with apparent curiosity. "It does look deliberate," she agreed. "Who would do such a thing? And why?" "Those are exactly the questions we intend to answer," Richter replied. "Your personnel file indicates you worked in aircraft maintenance before the war. Tell me about that experience." Elena had prepared for this question, creating a cover story that explained her mechanical skills while avoiding any connection to military aircraft. She described fictional work at a civilian airfield, repairing small private planes and transport aircraft. Her story was detailed enough to be convincing, but vague enough to be difficult to verify. The interrogation continued through the night and into the following day. Elena was given minimal food and water and was not allowed to sleep. The constant questioning and harsh conditions were designed to break down her resistance and force her to reveal inconsistencies in her story. But Elena's training had prepared her for exactly this situation. She maintained her cover identity despite the physical and psychological pressure, never wavering from her story or revealing any knowledge of Operation Thunderbolt or her true mission. On the second day of questioning, Richter's approach changed. Instead of focusing solely on the sabotage, he began asking about other personnel on the base, trying to get Elena to implicate her colleagues. This told Elena that the investigation was expanding and that Richter suspected the existence of a broader conspiracy. "We know there are Soviet agents operating in this area," Richter said during one session. "We've intercepted radio transmissions and have evidence of intelligence-gathering activities. If you cooperate with us and provide information about these agents, we can arrange for lenient treatment." Elena realized that her radio transmission might have been detected, even though she had used sophisticated encryption and frequency-hopping techniques. The Germans had clearly intercepted some form of enemy communication, though they might not know specifically what information had been transmitted. I don't know anything about Soviet agents, Elena replied, maintaining her facade of innocent confusion. I just want to do my work and stay out of trouble. I have no interest in politics or espionage. As the interrogation entered its third day, Elena began to worry that even her extensive training might not be enough to maintain her cover indefinitely. The combination of sleep deprivation, minimal nutrition, and constant psychological pressure was beginning to affect her ability to think clearly and respond consistently. More concerning was the fact that she still didn't know if her intelligence transmission had been successfully received by Soviet forces. If the information about Operation Thunderbolt hadn't reached its intended recipients, then her sacrifice would be meaningless and thousands of people would die in the planned offensive. Elena also realized that other members of the resistance network might be in danger. Although she had operated largely independently, there were local contacts who had provided support and information. If the Germans succeeded in breaking her cover, they would undoubtedly pursue these connections, potentially destroying an entire intelligence network that had taken years to establish. On the morning of the fourth day, Colonel Richter entered the interrogation room with a different expression on his face. Elena could sense that something had changed in the investigation, though she couldn't determine whether the change was favorable or ominous. "Elena Kozlova," Richter said, settling into his chair across from her. "We've made some interesting discoveries about you." Elena's heart stopped as Colonel Richter opened a folder containing what appeared to be intelligence reports and photographs. After 4 days of interrogation, she had maintained her cover story despite intense pressure, but she could see from Richter's expression that something fundamental had changed in the investigation. "Your background story is very impressive," Richter began, spreading documents across the table between them. "Elena Kozlova, born in Minsk, 1919. Parents killed in the German advance, worked at civilian airfield before the war. Excellent mechanical skills. No political affiliations, grateful for employment under German administration." Elena said nothing, waiting to see what Richter had discovered. "The problem is," Richter continued, "Elena Kozlova died of typhus in December 1941. We found her grave in the civilian cemetery, along with burial records maintained by the local authorities. So the question becomes, who are you, and why are you using a dead woman's identity?" Elena felt the careful construction of months of preparation crumbling around her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "That's impossible," she said, injecting confusion and fear into her voice. "I don't know what those records show, but I can assure you I am very much alive." Richter smiled coldly. "Perhaps there was another Elena Kozlova. Perhaps the records are confused. These things happen in wartime." He leaned forward across the table. "But combined with other evidence we've discovered, it creates a very interesting picture." He produced another document, this one bearing official German military stamps. 3 days ago, we intercepted a sophisticated radio transmission from this base. The transmission was encrypted using Soviet military codes and contained detailed intelligence about German military operations. The transmission originated from somewhere in the main hangar area, exactly where you were working that night. Elena realized her situation was becoming desperate, but she maintained her facade of innocent confusion. "I don't understand what you're suggesting, Colonel. I was performing routine maintenance that night." "I don't know anything about radio transmissions or military codes." "Perhaps not," Richter replied. "But here's what's particularly interesting. The transmission we intercepted contained extremely detailed information about Operation Thunderbolt. Information that could only have been obtained by someone with access to General Kellner's classified documents." Elena's mind raced as she processed this revelation. If the Germans had intercepted her transmission, they knew exactly what intelligence she had gathered and transmitted to Soviet forces, but Richter's tone suggested they were still uncertain about her specific involvement. We've searched your quarters and found no evidence of espionage equipment, Richter continued. We've also verified your work assignments and confirmed that you were indeed in the hangar performing legitimate maintenance duties on the night of the transmission. This creates an interesting puzzle. Elena began to understand Richter's strategy. He had substantial evidence pointing to her involvement, but not enough to definitively prove her guilt. He was trying to get her to confess by convincing her that continued denial was futile. "Colonel," Elena said, adopting a tone of frightened sincerity, "I understand that you need to investigate these serious matters, but I'm just a mechanic trying to survive in difficult times. I have no knowledge of espionage or military secrets. If someone used my presence in the hangar to cover their activities, I was completely unaware of it." Richter studied her face for a long moment. "There's something else you should know," he said finally. "General Kellner's replacement aircraft arrived yesterday morning. He's already departed for Berlin, and Operation Thunderbolt will proceed on schedule. So even if you are the agent we're looking for, your mission has ultimately failed." Elena felt a crushing weight settle on her chest, but she forced herself not to react visibly. If Kellner had reached Berlin and the operation was proceeding, then her sabotage and intelligence gathering might have been for nothing. Unless her radio transmission had been successfully received by Soviet forces, thousands of innocent people were still going to die. "That's good news," Elena said, trying to sound genuinely pleased. "I'm sure the general is an important person, and delays in his work could have serious consequences." Richter's eyes narrowed slightly at her response, but before he could continue the questioning, an aide entered the room and whispered urgently in his ear. Elena watched as Richter's expression changed from suspicion to surprise to what looked like confusion. "It seems," Richter said slowly, "that we've received some unexpected news from the Eastern Front." He dismissed the aide and turned back to Elena. "Operation Thunderbolt has been postponed indefinitely. Soviet forces appear to have gained detailed intelligence about the planned offensive and have repositioned their defenses accordingly." Elena felt a surge of triumph that she struggled to conceal. Her transmission had been received successfully, and Soviet forces had used her intelligence to prepare for the German offensive. The operation that was supposed to end the war in Germany's favor had been effectively neutralized before it could begin. "I'm sorry to hear the operation has been delayed," Elena said, maintaining her cover persona. "Though I admit I don't really understand military matters." Richter leaned back in his chair, studying Elena with renewed intensity. "The interesting thing is that the Soviet defensive preparations indicate they had extremely detailed intelligence about our plans. Not just general knowledge of an offensive, but specific information about troop movements, timing, target locations, and tactical approaches. The kind of information that could only have come from someone with access to the highest levels of operational planning." Elena realized that her success in transmitting the intelligence was now creating additional danger for her. The Germans would inevitably conclude that there had been a security breach at the airfield, and the investigation would intensify rather than diminishing. "It sounds like Soviet intelligence is more capable than our commanders expected," Elena said carefully. "Perhaps they have agents in Berlin who gained access to the planning documents." "Perhaps," Richter agreed. "But the timing of the intelligence breach coincides remarkably well with the sabotage of General Kellner's aircraft and the radio transmission from this base. That suggests the leak originated here, not in Berlin." Before Elena could respond, another aide entered the room with what appeared to be an urgent message. Richter read it quickly, and Elena watched his face grow dark with anger. "It seems the situation has become even more complex," Richter said grimly. "Soviet forces have launched a coordinated counteroffensive targeting 3 of our major supply depots. The attacks are hitting exactly the locations that were supposed to be secured as part of Operation Thunderbolt. This level of intelligence penetration indicates we're dealing with a sophisticated espionage network, not just a single agent." Elena felt another wave of satisfaction at this news. Not only had Soviet forces used her intelligence to prepare defenses against Operation Thunderbolt, they had also used it to launch their own offensive operations against German positions. Her mission had achieved far more than she had dared to hope. "That sounds very serious," Elena said, trying to project appropriate concern. "I hope our forces can respond effectively to these attacks." Richter stood up abruptly and began pacing around the small interrogation room. Elena could sense his frustration and anger, and realized that the failure of Operation Thunderbolt was likely to have significant consequences for his own career. "You know what I find most interesting about this entire situation?" Richter said, stopping directly in front of Elena's chair. "Every piece of evidence points to you being the agent we're looking for, but you've maintained your cover story with remarkable consistency despite days of intensive questioning. Either you're telling the truth, and we're dealing with the most sophisticated false identity operation in military history, or you're one of the most highly trained operatives I've ever encountered." Elena met his gaze steadily. "I'm just Elena Kozlova, Colonel. I understand why you might be suspicious given all the strange things that have happened, but I can only tell you the truth about who I am and what I've done." Richter stared at her for another long moment, then returned to his seat. "Here's what's going to happen," he said finally. "I can't prove you're a Soviet agent, but I also can't prove you're not. Given the security situation on this base, I can't risk keeping potential enemy operatives in sensitive positions." Elena's heart sank as she realized what Richter was about to say. "You're being transferred to a labor camp in occupied Poland. It's not an arrest or an execution, but it will remove you from any position where you could potentially cause further damage to German operations. Consider it protective custody for both sides." Elena had expected this outcome as soon as her cover identity began unraveling, but the reality was still devastating. Transfer to a labor camp was effectively a death sentence, though it might take months or years instead of days. More importantly, it would end any possibility of continuing her intelligence work against German forces. "I understand, Colonel," Elena said quietly. "When will the transfer take place?" "Tomorrow morning," Richter replied. "You'll be processed with the next transport of workers heading west." As Elena was escorted back to her cell, she reflected on what she had accomplished. The sabotage of General Kellner's aircraft had delayed Operation Thunderbolt just long enough for her to gather and transmit crucial intelligence to Soviet forces. That intelligence had not only allowed Soviet commanders to prepare effective defenses, but had also enabled them to launch counterattacks that were currently threatening German supply lines. Operation Thunderbolt, the offensive that was supposed to end the war in Germany's favor, had been completely neutralized. Instead of a crushing German victory, the Eastern Front would see continued Soviet resistance and potentially a shift in momentum toward the Red Army. Elena knew she would likely never see her homeland again, but she also knew that her sacrifice had meaning. The thousands of civilians who would have died in the planned offensive would live. The Soviet soldiers who would have been overwhelmed by the coordinated German attacks would have the chance to continue fighting. The war that had seemed lost just days earlier now had the possibility of a different outcome. That night, in her cell awaiting transfer to the labor camp, Elena wrote a letter to her sister using paper and pencil that a sympathetic guard had provided. She couldn't include any details about her real activities, but she tried to convey her love and her hope that better times were coming. The next morning, Elena was loaded onto a transport truck with 40 other prisoners and workers being relocated to labor camps. As the truck pulled away from the airfield, she caught one last glimpse of the hangar where she had spent months gathering intelligence and planning the sabotage that had changed the course of the war. Elena Kozlova never made it to the labor camp. The transport convoy was attacked by Soviet partisans 2 days later, and in the confusion of the battle, Elena managed to escape into the forest. She would spend the remainder of the war working with partisan units, using her technical skills to sabotage German equipment and communication lines. After the war ended, Elena returned to her hometown to find that her sister had survived and was raising a family in the rebuilt community. Elena never told anyone about her role in stopping Operation Thunderbolt, preferring to let history record it as a strategic victory for Soviet intelligence rather than the desperate action of one woman who refused to let genocide proceed unopposed. Years later, when historians analyzed the turning points of the Eastern Front, many would identify the failure of Operation Thunderbolt as the moment when German hopes for victory in the East were definitively crushed. They would never know that the entire operation had been stopped by a female aircraft mechanic who understood that sometimes one person in the right place at the right time could indeed change the course of history. Elena lived the rest of her life quietly, working as a teacher and raising a family of her own. She died peacefully in 1987, taking her secrets with her. But the thousands of people who lived because Operation Thunderbolt never happened were her true monument, a testament to the courage of one woman who refused to remain silent in the face of evil.